The winter that year came early to the Fraser Valley, the kind of cold that settles into your joints before the calendar gives it permission. The mountains to the east had gone white by the first week of October, and the fog that rolled in off the river each morning never quite burned away before dark. That was the autumn Warren Colt moved back to his father's property on Sumas Prairie Road, not because he wanted to, and not because anyone had asked him to, but because there was nowhere else left to go. He was 64 years old. He had served 22 years in the United States Army, 2 tours in the Gulf and 1 in Afghanistan. And he had come home from all of it with a bad left knee, a hearing aid he hated wearing, and a chocolate Labrador named Copper, who had been with him for 9 of those years and understood him better than most people ever had. Warren had built a life in Abbotsford after he retired from service, a modest one, but real. A small house on a corner lot, a routine, a sense of ground beneath his feet. Then his daughter's husband lost the contracting business. And then his daughter called. And then Warren had signed over a loan that became something more permanent without ever quite agreeing to it. And then the house on the corner lot was gone. He did not blame his daughter. He had told himself that so many times it had almost come true. The property on Sumas Prairie Road had belonged to his father, Earl Colt, who had died 11 years earlier, and left the land to Warren in a handwritten will that the family lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Ashford, had registered without incident. The land itself was 5 acres of flat field with a drainage ditch along the eastern edge and a stand of cottonwoods at the back that turned gold in October and dropped everything by November. The old farmhouse had been rented out for years and was in reasonable shape. The barn beside it was not, but attached to the north side of the barn, half buried in the slope of the land the way old things often are in the Fraser Valley, was a root cellar that Warren's father had built himself sometime in the early 1960s. Heavy cedar planks, a rusted iron latch, a door that took both hands and some patience to open. Warren had played in there as a boy. He had hidden in there once during a thunderstorm. When he was 7, his father had come to find him and sat beside him in the dark, without saying a single word, until the thunder moved east. And that silence had been one of the kindest things anyone had ever done for him. He had not been inside it in 30 years. The farmhouse tenant had moved out in August. Warren arrived in early November, with Copper in the cab of his truck, 2 duffel bags of clothing, a box of books, and the particular quality of tiredness that doesn't come from a long drive. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you've ever had to start over when you thought starting over was behind you, I think you'll understand Warren Colt. The farmhouse smelled like someone else's life, a faint trace of cooking oil, pine cleaner, a child's rubber boot left behind a door. Warren moved through the rooms slowly on that first evening with Copper at his heel, not unpacking, just taking inventory. The kitchen window looked out toward the barn. The barn looked out toward nothing in particular. The cottonwoods had already dropped most of their leaves, and the branches moved in the wind like something uncertain. He slept on a cot that first night because the bed frame he'd ordered hadn't arrived yet, and he lay on his back, listening to the farmhouse settle around him, and thought about the fact that the last time he'd slept on a cot by choice was in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, and even then he'd had a mission brief to look forward to in the morning. Now the morning would bring whatever he decided to make of it, and that Freesome sat on his chest like a stone. Copper pressed against his legs in the dark. Warren put a hand on the dog's back and eventually slept. In the days that followed, he began the slow, humbling work of becoming useful. He called a contractor about the barn roof. He patched the gap under the south side of the farmhouse where the cold came through. He drove into town for groceries and hardware and learned which aisles of the Canadian Tire in Abbotsford had what he needed and which checkout clerks didn't need to talk while they scanned his items. Small things, the kind of things that add up to something only in retrospect. The neighbors on Sumas Prairie Road were spread apart in the way of agricultural land. close enough to be aware of each other, far enough to leave each other alone. The closest was a man named Terence, who ran a blueberry operation 2 properties north, and who came over one afternoon in the first week of November with a jar of last summer's preserves, and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had grown up in that valley and expected to die there. He shook Warren's hand on the porch and said he'd known Earl Colt, that his father had known Earl Colt, and that as far as he was concerned, the Colt property was in the right hands again. Warren had thanked him and meant it. What Warren had not been prepared for was the church. Terence had mentioned it offhandedly. The Sumas Prairie Community Fellowship, a congregation that had started small 20 years ago in the Legion Hall and had grown into its own building on the highway. A good community, Terence said. They'd taken care of the property when the tenant was in a difficult season, brought meals, helped with the field when it needed mowing. The pastor, a man called Aldous Reeve, had organized most of it. Warren was not a religious man in any formal sense, though he'd had his private conversations with whatever listened when a man is lying face down in a ditch in the dark. He was not opposed to community. He had been alone long enough to understand the value of it. He went to a Sunday service in mid-November because Terence invited him, and because it seemed like the right thing to do, the kind of thing his father would have done. The church was plain and warmly lit and smelled of coffee and candle wax. The congregation was mostly older, the women outnumbering the men by a margin that reminded Warren of every small town he'd ever known. They welcomed him the way rural communities welcome veterans, with a particular sincerity that is also slightly ceremonial, like they are honoring something that has come to rest among them. Pastor Aldous Reeve was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with a preacher's voice and a politician's handshaken eyes that moved around a room with an attention that Warren, from long habit, recognized as the attention of someone who is always computing. He clasped Warren's hand and said he'd heard about him from Terence, that the valley was grateful for his service, that the Colt property had good bones and a good history, and he hoped Warren would find peace there. "We look after our own out here," Pastor Reeve had said. Warren had smiled and accepted a cup of coffee and sat in the third pew and listened to the sermon, which was about forgiveness. He could not have told you later what specifically had made the back of his neck prickle. It might have been nothing. It might have been instinct developed over 22 years of reading rooms that could go wrong. He went back the following Sunday anyway, because Copper needed the company of people, and so, he admitted to himself, did he? The problem began with the land. In January, Warren was approached by a man named Dwight Farrow, who represented a land-holding company out of Surrey that had been quietly assembling agricultural property along the Sumas Prairie corridor for what he called future agricultural investment opportunities. He sat in Warren's kitchen and set papers on the table and named a figure that was fair, not extraordinary, but fair, and said the company was interested in purchasing the 5 acres. Warren told him he would think about it. He was still thinking about it 2 weeks later when Pastor Reeve brought it up. They had been speaking after the Sunday service, standing near the coat hooks by the entrance, but the congregation had mostly filtered out. One of the church volunteers, a quiet woman named Iris, who organized the midweek suppers, was stacking chairs in the hall. Reeve mentioned that he'd heard Warren had been approached by Dwight Farrow's company, and Warren had said yes, that he was considering it, and Reeve had nodded slowly in that considered way he had. "I would encourage you to accept it," the pastor said. "The company has been good for the valley, and you've had a difficult period, Warren. There's no shame in simplifying." Warren had said he appreciated the counsel. On his way home that afternoon, Copper in the passenger seat, the bare fields running past the window, Warren thought about how Aldous Reeve knew that Dwight Farrow had come to see him, and how he'd known the figure offered, which Warren had not mentioned to anyone. He thought about it the way he thought about most things that didn't sit right, quietly, without rushing to a conclusion, but not letting go of the thread. He told Dwight Farrow he was not selling. 2 weeks after that, the rumor began. Warren learned about it first from Terence, who came to the door on a Tuesday morning in February, looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who is bringing news he wishes he didn't have to bring. The congregation was talking. The story, as it circulated, was that Warren Colt had misrepresented the property in some way when he'd registered it after his father's death. That the will had been altered, that there was another document, that Earl Colt had intended to leave the land to the church for a community garden project, and Warren had suppressed it. Warren stood on his porch in the February cold and felt the story land on him the way cold water lands, all at once, and in every direction. "Who started this?" he asked. Terence did not answer directly. He looked at the cottonwoods. He said he didn't know for certain. He said he was sorry. Warren went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Copper put his head on Warren's knee. The dog had a way of knowing, had always had a way of knowing, when the weight of a moment called for stillness. The following Sunday, Warren went to the service, not because he felt welcome. He could feel the shift in temperature, the moment he walked through the door, the way eyes moved past him instead of toward him, the way conversations rerouted. He went because retreat had never been his first instinct. He went and sat in the third pew and listened to Aldous Reeves speak about truth, about stewardship, about the obligations we have to one another and to the land. The word stewardship was used 4 times, Warren counted. After the service, a woman named Dorothy, who had always been kind to him, did not meet his eyes when he passed. An older man he knew only as Baxter crossed the parking lot to avoid walking near him. Iris, the volunteer who stacked the chairs, gave him a look that was something between pity and apology, and then looked quickly away. He drove home along Sumas Prairie Road, and the flat white fields and the gray February sky felt like a verdict. He did not go back the following Sunday. March was the hardest month. The rumor had moved beyond the congregation by then. It had reached the coffee shop in town where Warren occasionally ate breakfast. He could tell, not because anyone said anything to his face, but because conversations paused when he walked in and resumed slightly differently when he sat down. Because the contractor who'd been working on the barn roof found a reason to delay, and then another reason, and then stopped returning calls. Because Warren Colt, who had survived 2 wars, and one that people stopped calling a war before it was finished, found himself feeling genuinely alone in a way that the wars had never quite managed. Copper saved him from the worst of it, in the way that dogs do, not by solving anything, but by requiring him to be present. Feeding times. The walk along the drainage ditch each morning. Copper moving ahead of him through the dead grass along the field's edge. Nose working, ears working, entirely absorbed in the business of the world at ground level, while Warren walked behind him and tried to stay in his own body. It was on one of those walks, in the 3rd week of March, that Copper stopped. They were near the base of the slope where the root cellar was built into the side of the rise. Maybe 15 meters from the old cedar door, Copper had wandered in that direction. He liked to nose along the stone foundation, and he'd stopped in a way that was different from the stopping he did when he caught a scent. He was digging, not the idle scratching of a dog at a patch of disturbed soil, but the earnest, focused, fully committed digging of a dog who has decided something important is located immediately beneath his front paws. "Hey," Warren said. "Copper, leave it." Copper did not leave it. He dug with increasing conviction, and when Warren came closer, he saw that the dog had found a section of ground beside the root cellar's foundation where the soil was slightly different in color. Darker, more recently turned, though recently in that soil might mean 2 years or 10. Warren crouched down beside him. The ground was soft in a way that suggested it had been dug before, and replaced, packed down, allowed to settle. Copper's nose went in up to his ears. Warren went to the barn and came back with a spade. He dug for 20 minutes in the late afternoon light, Copper watching now from a respectful distance, until the spade hit something that was not soil and not stone. He cleared around it carefully. the way he'd been trained long ago to clear things he didn't fully understand yet. What emerged was a metal document box, the kind sold at any office supply store, fireproof, with a combination dial. It was sealed. It was old enough to have some surface rust on the hinges, but structurally intact. Someone had wrapped it in a layer of heavy plastic before burying it, and the plastic had held. Warren sat back on his heels and looked at it. Then he looked at Copper, who looked back at him with the patient, certain expression of a dog who has completed the task he set out to complete and is waiting for the next instruction. "Okay," Warren said. "Okay." He carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. He did not open it that evening. He poured a glass of water and sat across from it in the kitchen light and thought about his father, who had built the root cellar with his own, and who had sat beside a small boy in the dark during a thunderstorm, and understood that sometimes the kindest thing is to simply be present without words. Earl Colt had been a methodical man, a precise man, a man who, when he decided something mattered, did not leave it to chance. Warren found the combination on the third attempt, his father's Army service number, the same number Earl had used as the combination on his lockbox. For 40 years, the number Warren had memorized watching his father open it on Sunday mornings to check the farm accounts. The box opened. Inside a sealed plastic sleeve, was his father's original handwritten will. Not the copy registered with the lawyer, but the original with his father's signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses Warren recognized. A neighbor who had since passed, and a man named Eddie Huang, who had been Earl Colt's oldest friend, and who Warren knew had retired to Campbell River. Beneath the will was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten in his father's careful, upright script, dated September of the year before Earl died. Warren read it at the kitchen table while Copper lay under his chair. The letter was addressed to Warren by name. It began, "If you are reading this, then something I hoped would not happen has happened anyway, because that is the nature of things I could not fully prevent." His father wrote that a man from the congregation. He did not use Reeves' name, but he described the approach, the offer, the slow pressure, had come to see him in the last year of his life about the property. That the man had suggested Earl consider leaving the land to the church for a community project. That his father had said he would pray on it, which was the polite version of no, in Earl Colt's vocabulary. That the approach had continued, with increasing specificity about what the community could do with the land, and increasing implication that Earl's legacy in the valley would be better served by generosity than by inheritance. His father had written, "I am not a suspicious man, Warren, but I was a soldier before I was a farmer, and I know when someone wants something badly enough to make wanting it sound like doing you a favor." He had also written, "I have left the land to you because it is yours, because you are my son, and because I have watched you carry things your whole life without setting them down and complaining about the weight. You have earned the right to some ground that is your own." At the bottom of the box, beneath the plastic sleeve, was something Warren had not expected. A manila envelope, sealed, with a note clipped to the front in his father's writing. The note said, "For the lawyer, if it comes to that, it won't come to that. But if it does," inside the envelope was a signed and witnessed statutory declaration, prepared by a notary, whose stamp and signature were both legible, in which Earl Colt stated that he had never agreed to leave the Sumas Prairie property to the Sumas Prairie Community Fellowship, that no such agreement existed in any form, and that any document suggesting otherwise was not authorized by him. The declaration was dated. It was legal. It was, Warren understood as he held it in his hands in his father's farmhouse kitchen. Everything. He sat there for a long time. Outside, the March wind moved through the cottonwoods, which were just beginning to think about putting out their first small leaves. He did not go to the church. He did not go to Pastor Reeve. He called the family lawyer first, not Mr. Ashford, who had been his father's, but a woman in Abbotsford, recommended by a veterans advocacy group named Catherine Yee, who listened to what he described without interrupting, and then asked 4 precise questions, and then told him to bring everything in. The statutory declaration and the original will were enough. Catherine Yee explained the situation to Warren in the straightforward manner of someone who takes satisfaction in clarity. The rumor that had circulated about the will being altered was legally groundless, and now demonstrably so. The original will was valid and consistent with the registered copy. The statutory declaration addressed any question of a competing claim. If the fellowship or anyone connected to it wished to advance a legal challenge to the title, they would find nothing to stand on. "Do you want to pursue defamation?" she asked. Warren thought about it. "Not yet," he said. Catherine Yee gave him a small nod that suggested she respected that answer. The information moved through the community the way information moves in small communities. Not through any single announcement, but through the accumulated weight of what people know about each other and how they know it. Terence heard it first, from his cousin who knew Catherine Yee's assistant. He called Warren on a Thursday evening and said that he'd heard and that he was sorry for what had been said and that he was glad it was sordid. Warren thanked him and meant it, the same way he had meant it the first time. Others came in the weeks that followed. Dorothy, at the coffee shop, who stopped him on his way out to say she should have asked more questions before she listened. The contractor who'd stopped returning calls left a voicemail, which Warren did not return. An older man from the congregation Warren had never properly met left a card in the mailbox at the end of the drive that said only, "I should have known better. I'm sorry." Warren put it on the kitchen windowsill. What no one said directly, and what Warren did not require anyone to say directly, was what had happened with Pastor Aldous Reeve. By late April, Reeve had taken what the congregation described as a leave of absence. The deacons of the church had apparently held several private meetings. Iris, the volunteer who stacked the chairs, had resigned. Whatever had been said in those rooms, Warren was not party to it and did not need to be. He was not interested in the architecture of someone else's reckoning. He had his land. He had his father's letter. He had Copper, who had found the thing that needed finding. Because dogs attend to the world, at a level that most people have stopped bothering to reach. By May, the blueberry fields north of the property had leafed out, and the drainage ditch along the east edge of Warren's land ran clear, and the cottonwoods had filled in completely. Green and breathing and indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them over the winter. Warren had gone back to the root cellar once, since the discovery, not to look for anything, but to stand in the doorway the way he had stood in it as a boy, and let the smell of cedar and cool earth come to him. It smelled exactly the same. He had stood there for a while and let himself feel that without explaining it. He had done some work on the barn. The roof was finished. The contractor eventually replaced, the interior cleared and swept. He had found a use for 2 of the outbuildings, and was considering what to do with the rest of the acreage. Whether to lease the field to Terence for the blueberry expansion he'd mentioned, or to do something with it himself. He was 64 years old and not in any particular hurry, and that was its own kind of gift. The bed frame had arrived and was assembled. The farmhouse smelled like himself now, which is the sign that a place has become a home. On the morning in late May that he walked the drainage ditch with Copper, and the sun was fully warm, for the first time since October, and the dog ran ahead through the new grass with his ears back, and his whole body expressing something that Warren thought might be the animal version of relief. On that morning, Warren Colt stopped at the eastern fence line and looked back across the 5 acres his father had given him and thought, "I am still here, not triumphant, not bitter, just still here," which, after everything, was the whole point. Copper circled back to him, checked in the way he always did, pressed briefly against his leg. "Good boy," Warren said. The valley was quiet and wide, and the mountains to the east had gone from white to gray to green over the course of the winter, and the season had turned without asking anyone's permission. The way seasons do, the way things return to you when you hold your ground and wait.